Chapter 23 of The Log of a Cowboy by Andy Adams. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Delivery. I shall never forget the next morning, August 26, 1882. As we of the 3rd Guard were relieved, about 2 hours before dawn, the wind veered around to the northwest, and a mist which had been falling during the forepart of our watch changed to soft flakes of snow. As soon as we were relieved, we scurried back to our blankets, drew the tarpaulin over our heads, and slept until dawn, when, on being awakened by the foreman, we found a wet, slushy snow some 2 inches in depth on the ground. Several of the boys in the outfit declared it was the first snowfall they had ever seen, and I had but a slight recollection of having witnessed one in early boyhood in our old Georgia home. We gathered around the fire like a lot of frozen children, and our only solace was that our drive was nearing an end. The 2 placermen paid little heed to the raw morning, and our pilot assured us that this was but the squaw winter which always preceded the Indian summer. We made our customary early start, and while saddling up that morning, Flood and the 2 placer miners packed the beef on their 2 pack horses, first cutting off enough to last us several days. The cattle, when we overtook them, presented a sorry spectacle, apparently being as cold as we were, although we had our last stitch of clothing on, including our slickers belted with a horse hobble. But when Flood and our guide rode past the herd, I noticed our pilot's coat was not even buttoned, nor was the thin cotton shirt which he wore, but his chest was exposed to that raw morning air which chilled the very marrow in our bones. Our foreman and guide kept in sight in the lead, the herd traveling briskly up the long mountain divide, and about the middle of the forenoon the sun came out warm and the snow began to melt. Within an hour after starting that morning, Quince Forrest, who was riding in front of me in the swing, dismounted, and picking out of the snow a brave little flower, which looked something like a pansy, dropped back to me and said, "My weather gauge says it's 88 degrees below freezing, but I want you to smell this posy, Quirk, and tell me on the dead thieving, do you ever expect to see your sunny southern home again? And did you notice the pock-marked colonel bearing his brisket to the morning breeze?" 2 hours after the sun came out, the snow had disappeared, and the cattle fell to and grazed until long after the noon hour. Our pilot led us up the divide between the Missouri and the headwaters of the Musselshell during the afternoon, weaving in and out around the heads of creeks putting into either river, and towards evening we crossed quite a creek running towards the Missouri, where we secured ample water for the herd. We made a late camp that night, and our guide assured us that another half-day's drive would put us on the Judith River, where we would intercept the Fort Benton road. The following morning our guide led us for several hours up a gradual ascent to the plateau till we reached the tableland, when he left us to return to his own camp. Flood again took the lead, and within a mile we turned on our regular course, which by early noon had descended into the valley of the Judith River, and entered the Fort Maginnis and Benton military road. Our route was now clearly defined, and about noon on the last day of the month we sighted, beyond the Missouri River, the flag floating over Fort Benton. We made a crossing that afternoon below the fort, and Flood went into the post, expecting either to meet Lovell or to receive our final instructions regarding the delivery. After crossing the Missouri, we grazed the herd over to the Teton River, a stream which paralleled the former watercourse, the military post being located between the two. We had encamped for the night when Flood returned with word of a letter he had received from our employer and an interview he had had with the commanding officer of Fort Benton, who, it seemed, was to have a hand in the delivery of the herd. Lovell had been detained in the final settlement of my brother Bob's herd at the Crow Agency by some differences regarding weights. Under our present instructions, we were to proceed slowly to the Blackfoot Agency, and immediately on the arrival of Lovell at Benton, he and the Commandant would follow by ambulance and overtake us. The distance from Fort Benton to the agency was variously reported to be from 120 to 130 miles, 6 or 7 days' travel for the herd at the farthest, and then goodbye Circle Dots. A number of officers and troopers from the post overtook us the next morning and spent several hours with us as the herd trailed out up the Teton. They were riding fine horses, which made our through saddle stock look insignificant in comparison, though had they covered 2,400 miles and lived on grass as had our mounts, some of the luster of their glossy coats would have been absent. They looked well, but it would have been impossible to use them or any domestic bred horse in trail work like ours, unless a supply of grain could be carried with us. The range country produced a horse suitable to range needs, hardy and a good forager, which, when not overworked under the saddle, met every requirement of his calling, as well as being self-sustaining. Our horses, in fact, were in better flesh when we crossed the Missouri than they were the day we received the herd on the Rio Grande. The spectators from the fort quitted us near the middle of the forenoon, and we snailed on westward at our leisurely gait. There was a fair road up the Teton, which we followed for several days without incident, to the fork of that river, where we turned up Muddy Creek, the north fork of the Teton. That noon, while catching saddle horses, dinner not being quite ready, we noticed a flurry amongst the cattle, then almost a mile in our rear. 2 men were on herd with them as usual, grazing them forward up the creek and watering as they came, when suddenly the cattle in the lead came tearing out of the creek, and on reaching open ground, turned at bay. After several bunches had seemingly taken fright at the same object, we noticed Bull Durham, who was on herd, ride through the cattle to the scene of disturbance. We saw him, on nearing the spot, lie down on the neck of his horse, watch intently for several minutes, then quietly drop back to the rear, circle the herd, and ride for the wagon. We had been observing the proceeding closely, though from a distance, for some time. Daylight was evidently all that saved us from a stampede, and as Bull Durham galloped up, he was almost breathless. He informed us that an old cinnamon bear and 2 cubs were berrying along the creek and had taken the right of way. Then there was a hustling and borrowing of cartridges, while saddles were cinched onto horses, as though human life depended on alacrity. We were all feeling quite gala, anyhow, and this looked like a chance for some sport. It was hard to hold the impulsive ones in check until the others were ready. The cattle pointed us to the location of the quarry as we rode forward. When within a quarter of a mile, we separated into 2 squads in order to gain the rear of the bears, cut them off from the creek, and force them into the open. The cattle held the attention of the bears until we had gained their rear, and as we came up between them and the creek, the old one reared up on her haunches and took a most astonished and innocent look at us. A single woof brought one of the cubs to her side, and she dropped on all fours and lumbered off, a half a dozen shots hastening her pace in an effort to circle the horsemen who were gradually closing in. In making this circle to gain the protection of some thickets which skirted the creek, she was compelled to cross quite an open space, and before she had covered the distance of 50 yards, a rain of ropes came down on her, and she was thrown backward with no less than 4 lariats fastened over her neck and foreparts. Then ensued a lively scene, for the horses snorted, and in spite of rowels refused to face the bear. But our ropes, securely snubbed to pommels, held them to the quarry. 2 minor circuses were meantime in progress with the 2 cubs, but pressure of duty held those of us who had fastened on to the old cinnamon. The ropes were taut, and several of them were about her throat. The horses were pulling in as many different directions, yet the strain of all the lariats failed to choke her as we expected. At this juncture, 4 of the loose men came to our rescue, and proposed shooting the brute.